a testimony of shared light, the reignited fire. Let me speak to you directly, without the comfortable padding of academic distance or the anesthetic of polite conversation. This is not a nostalgic wound I am nursing. This is an emergency call from the collapsing ruins of a world we once knew how to inhabit. You have felt it, that cold draft seeping through the cracks in what we used to call community, the suspicion that greets a stranger's kindness, the hollow ring when someone speaks of neighbors as if that word still means something real. What I am about to tell you is not a theory. It is a post-mortem on the life that was lost, and more importantly, a field manual for resurrection. The enemy we feared was always supposed to be outside the walls. That was the old story, the barbarians, the invading armies, the forces of chaos waiting at the gates. But I have watched the walls fall from within. I have seen the foundations crumble under the slow rot of transaction, the creeping mold of mutual suspicion, the dry rot of a generation raised to see every human being as a potential threat to be managed rather than a potential brother or sister to be trusted. The shadow within the walls has no face, no army, no leader. It is simply the absence of what we once called the covenant, the unspoken agreement that we were in this together, that your child was in some essential way my responsibility, that my word was my bond even when the binding was inconvenient, that the handshake meant more than the contract it replaced. What I want to examine with you is how this happened and what we can do about it. Not in the abstract, not as a matter of historical record, but as a matter of urgent survival. I want to look at this through the lenses that reveal different facets of the same broken mirror, because like the blind men and the elephant, each way of seeing catches only a piece of the truth, and only by holding all the pieces together can we see what we are actually dealing with. Consider first what philosophy would make of this. The rationalists would call it absurd, this clinging to unwritten laws in a world that has forgotten the very concept of covenant. They would cite Nietzsche and declare the old values dead, buried under the weight of modernity, and tell us we must become creators of new values, or accept that we are merely animals pretending at meaning. There is a certain brutal honesty in this critique that I respect. But here is what the philosophers miss when they dismiss the old ways. They assume that values are inventions that can be replaced like software versions, that human beings are blank slates upon which any operating system can be installed. The evidence of human history tells a different story. Every durable human society has developed some version of the covenant, some set of unwritten rules that treated the stranger as potentially ally rather than automatically enemy, that made cooperation not merely possible but probable, that created what economists call social capital and what the ancients called honor. This is not sentimental attachment to the past. This is empirical observation about human survival. A society that runs on pure self-interest, where every interaction is transactional and every promise is contingent, will eventually consume itself. The logic is simple and terrifying. Love, respect, and honor are not self-sustaining systems. They are fragile, living things, dependent on the soil of collective memory. If that soil is eroded, if we let the younger generations believe the world has always been this way, a cacophony of suspicion, greed, and mutual destruction, then we have already surrendered. From the perspective of religious studies, this would look like syncretism, the fusion of Norse honor and Christian love without the scaffolding of Orthodox doctrine. The Viking ideal of death on a bed of spears, earned in battle against overwhelming odds, mingles with the Christian insistence that a life lived in love, even in the midst of death, glorifies something larger than the self. Critics would say this is a contradiction. The Viking sought to earn glory. The Christian seeks to receive unmerited grace. One is about heroic self-assertion. The other is about humble surrender. But here is what the theologians miss when they demand consistency. The function of both systems was the same. Both demanded that the self, whether tribal, national, or spiritual, be extinguished in service of something larger than the individual. Both rejected what the old texts called straw death, the passive decay of a life lived only for oneself. Both understood that human beings need something worth dying for, because the thing worth living for is often indistinguishable from it. The younger generation has been taught that the self is sacred, that dignity lies in autonomy, that worth is measured in personal success. The older generations, by clinging to the belief that shared humanity can transcend the chaos of individualism, are heretics in this new order. We are not even allowed to speak about it without being dismissed as fossils or fools. But when the systems fail, the politicians, the governments, the economists, it is not their failure that will doom us. It is the absence of a moral foundation that made those systems possible. If we do not remind the world that civilization built on might makes right is civilization in denial of its own collapse, then the collapse is already here, spreading through the foundations like white rot through oak. Let us turn to what psychology reveals. The clinical language would be identity formation, attachment theory, cognitive dissonance. They might ask why we older generations cling to a version of humanity that no longer exists. Is it denial? Is it failure to adapt? Perhaps. But let me tell you what the psychologists miss in their careful diagnostic categories. The younger generation does not have a self to protect in the way we once understood it. They are fragments, assembled from a billion digital reflections, curated, performative, and terrified of being canceled. They are not raised to belong to a story. They are tasked with broadcasting a brand. The result is not a self, but a scattered committee of competing desires, chronically adrift, unable to risk the vulnerability that real covenant requires. This is not a knock on young people. It is a description of what happens when you raise an entire generation in a world where every boundary is porous, every relationship is a negotiation, and every act of trust is met with a silent question. What do they want from me? The older generation's shared knowledge is not a relic. It is a lifeline to something unquantifiable, the sense of belonging to a story larger than oneself. Without that story, the younger generation is not free. It is adrift. And adrift souls are fertile ground for what can only be called a satanic religion of self-love, worship of the self as the only worthy deity, sacrifice of all other loyalties on its altar. It is not enough to be passionate about love and respect in the abstract. The passion must root in a shared narrative, a common memory of what once was and what still could be. I know because I lived in a different world. Here is the data point. Here is the proof of concept. From the vantage point of political science, this looks like a failure of the formal mechanisms of collective decision making. Politicians will never tell a story about a man who looked out for his neighbor's child. That is not the kind of story that wins elections or builds platforms. The political system operates in a moral vacuum that it cannot fill, because the problem is pre-political. You cannot legislate virtue. You cannot pass a law commanding brotherly love. A political system that has lost its moral foundations becomes merely another arena for the zero-sum game, another institution to be gamed by those who have no stake in the common good. To look to such a system to heal the rupture that enables its own corruption is a fool's errand. The solution must be built in the space politics has abandoned, the space between people in the quiet negotiations of daily life, in the small acts of trust and reciprocity that build social capital one handshake at a time. Economics, if it is honest, reveals something uncomfortable about its own assumptions. The dominant model, Homo economicus, the rational self-interested actor maximizing utility, has escaped the textbooks and become our cultural script. It makes a virtue of selfishness and renders altruism irrational. It creates artificial scarcities not of food or shelter, but of status, security, and dignity to keep us in permanent competition. It tells us our worth is our net worth. Karl Polanyi warned us about this, about the market society that seeks to disembed the economy from social relations, destroying the very fabric of community in the process. The old unwritten laws were the social fabric that kept the economy from consuming everything. When we let that fabric fray, when we allowed the logic of the market to penetrate domains where it does not belong, the family, the neighborhood, the friendship, the civic association, we created the conditions for our own atomization. The systems that depend on trust and goodwill are now consuming the trust and goodwill they need to function. It is a slow motion suicide dressed up as efficiency. History offers the final lens and the most sobering. Every era romanticizes some past that never quite existed. The golden age always excludes someone, the outsider, the dissenter, the different group. Every generation that looks backward sees through the lens of loss, filtering out the violence, the oppression, the failures that were just as real as the virtues. We older generations are not exempt from this tendency. We remember the handshake, but forget the hierarchies that made some handshakes more equal than others. We remember the covenant, but forget who was left outside its walls. This is the historian's necessary corrective, and we must receive it with humility. But, and this is the crucial pivot, the correction should not lead us to discard the baby with the bathwater. The truth of the past is not its perfection. The truth is its proof of concept. Human beings, with all their flaws and failures, were capable of building high-trust, reciprocal societies. That capability is the tool we have mislaid. Forgetting that we ever had this tool is more dangerous than romanticizing its past use. The history I am asking us to remember is not the history of Eden. It is the history of demonstrated human capacity for cooperation. It is the history of the possible. Now let me speak to you in the language of horror, because horror is the only language adequate to what we are facing. Not the cheap horror of monsters and gore, but the deeper horror of slow decay, of meaning collapsing inward on itself, of a generation growing up in the ruins of a world that once believed in something larger than the individual. From the Gothic perspective, the world we describe is already a cathedral of decaying glory. The bed of straw is not an end. It is a state, the slow, creeping dissolution of trust and virtue, as the walls of our once forged communities crumble under the weight of transactional ethics and self-promotion. The supernatural element here is the loss of meaning itself. The younger generation is haunted not by ghosts, but by the specter of a hollow existence, where love is a commodity and honor is a performance. The nightmare of malice they imagine outside the walls is now a grotesque reality within the city, where might makes right is not a slogan but the rule of survival. The romanticism lies in the older generation's testimony. It is a love letter to a forgotten humanity, written in the ink of memory and loss. The emotion is not passive grief, it is rage. The kind of rage that recognizes a city as being raised by its own foundations and refuses to be a silent spectator. The cosmic horror that undergirds all this is the silence of the stars. The universe does not care. It never has. The Vikings' glory, the Christians' agape love, the psychologist's search for belonging, the economist's calculations, all of it collapses before the abyss of the indifferent cosmos. And here is the counterintuitive truth that the cosmic horror writers understand better than the optimists. This is not a reason to despair. The world is not dying from a lack of solutions, but from a loss of memory. The older generation's task is not to prescribe a new moral system, but to retrieve and re-illuminate the old one. The younger generation's task is to believe that such a system was even possible in the first place. The philosophical absurdity, the religious parable, the psychological crisis, the sociological collapse, the political impotence, the economic distortion, the historical revision, all of it is tied to one fundamental question. What are we willing to trade ourselves for? The answer must not be wealth, influence, or comfort. It must be the resurrection of shared life, the handshake, the look in the eye, the keeping of one's word. These are the relics of a world where humans were not commodities. They are the unspoken laws that kept the city from becoming a tomb. The handshake civilization cannot survive on nostalgia alone, but it cannot be rebuilt without a memory of what it once was. The test is not a matter of survival. It is a matter of reclaiming our species. Let me now offer what I believe is the optimized delivery, the prescription refined through the analysis of how messages actually move people and change behavior. I want to structure this as a kind of field manual, because what we need is not another essay, but another way of operating. The delivery must begin with the reader's own latent pain. You already know the feeling. It is the glance over your shoulder in a parking lot, not because of crime stats, but because the default setting is now caution. It is the unspoken calculation in every interaction. What do they want? What do I owe? What can I get? This is the Gothic horror. It is not a monster under the bed. It is the slow, cold seep of distrust through the foundations of everything. The walls of our great cathedral, built on handshakes, shared sacrifice, the unspoken law that a neighbor's child is your own, are not being stormed. They are being abandoned. Ivy of apathy climbs the stones. The stained glass of shared story is cracked, and the light that once shone through it, the light that said we are in this together, grows dim. I am not telling you that you are sick. I am giving a name to the cold you already feel. This builds immediate, unarguable resonance. The diagnosis must come first, not the prescription, because people must feel that someone finally understands what they have been experiencing before they will listen to proposed solutions. The second act is the anatomy of how this happened. We must see the beast whole to fight it. Each disciplinary lens sees a limb, a tooth, a scale. The psychologist's report shows the monster feeding on fragmented cells, identities assembled from digital reflections rather than forged in the stable fire of family, craft, and local myth. The sociologist's map reveals a landscape depleted of social capital, a withdrawal into private fortresses while public squares become algorithmic marketplaces. The economist's equation exposes the cage of Homo economicus, the model that makes selfishness a virtue and renders altruism irrational. The political scientist's warning reveals a system co-opted by the very forces it was supposed to contain. The philosopher and historian remind us that there was no perfect past, but there was a proof of concept. Human beings were capable of building high-trust societies, and that capability is the tool we have mislaid. The key is to present this not as blame, but as explanation. This is not you kids are wrong. This is we all got enlisted in a system that breaks the old covenants. Depersonalize the problem to reduce defensive reactivity. The third act is the prescription. The analysis is useless without action. Here are the tools, not complex, ancient, their reactivation a revolutionary act. The first tool is strategic testimony. Your memory is not nostalgia. It is data, evidence that the current operating system is not the only one that can run. Your duty is to transmit this data. Do not lecture. Tell a story. To a young person, tell the story of when your word was your bond, and what it cost you, and why you would do it again. Tell the story of when a community rallied around a member in crisis without a GoFundMe page, without a viral campaign, just because that is what people did for each other. You start looking out for others because the survival of the ship is your survival. The fourth tool is cosmic defiance. This is where we confront the abyss and find our strength. The universe is silent. The stars are indifferent. They do not care if we build cathedrals or burn them. They do not care if we die on beds of straw or spears. This cosmic horror is not a reason to surrender. It is the only reason our choices have ultimate meaning. In a universe that guarantees nothing, the light we kindle for each other is the only light there will ever be. Your stubborn covenant, your act of testimony, your inconvenient kindness, these are not small things. They are acts of defiance shouted into the infinite silence. They are how we write our own meaning onto the void. The enemy within the walls is the whispered lie that because the cosmos is silent, we should be silent too. That because nothing is guaranteed, nothing is worth pledging our lives to. Prove it wrong. Let me leave you with this, because I want the ending not merely to diagnose or explain, but to command. The older generation does not need to die gloriously on the bed of spears to save the world. We need to die gloriously alive, to live in such a way that the younger generations can see the difference a shared humanity makes. The straw death is not the absence of death. It is the absence of meaning in life. The bed of spears is not just a battlefield. It is a declaration that the only life worth living is one where we are our brother's keepers, where our children are the legacy we leave, not the collateral we exploit. The test is not a test of the younger generation's morality. It is a test of the older one's courage. Will we let the walls fall with silence, or will we raise our voices so loudly, so defiantly, that even the dead can hear us demand a better world be built from the ashes? The answer is not in the systems of governance or the engines of capitalism. It is in the hands that still remember the handshake, in the eyes that still meet with honesty, in the hearts that still act as if the neighbor's child is their own to protect. To question everything is noble, but to question the truth of what once was is to invite the darkness to claim us all. The older generations did not live in a perfect world, but we lived in one that recognized its imperfections while still insisting on its humanity. The younger generations must not be allowed to forget that. They must be taught that love and respect were not just ideals but solutions, that the enemy was not just a force of malice but a state of mind, and that the only way to expel it is to replace it with the memory of a shared light. If you do not teach this, if you do not testify to how things could be, then the void within the walls will devour us, and the stars will continue their silent ascent, indifferent to our collapse. But if you teach it, if you make the young see that honor, respect, and love once bound us not because they were fashionable, but because they were necessary, then we will not be the last generation of the straw death. We will be the first generation of the shared light. This is not about going backward. It is about retrieving a vital piece of technology for going forward. The path ahead is dark and unknown. We cannot see the shore, but we have two choices. We can huddle alone in our private lifeboats, whispering fears, competing for the last drops of fresh water, destined to be swallowed by the uncaring sea. Or we can decide right now to rebuild the ship while we are still sailing, to patch the hull with our promises, to weave new rope from our trust, to navigate by the stars of stories told by the elders, to steer toward a horizon defined not by what we can take, but by what we can build together. The enemy is not at the gates. The enemy is the belief that we are no longer a crew. Disprove it. Transmit the data. Run the experiment. Reboot your identity. Start now. The first hand you reach for is the one beside you. The silent cosmos is waiting. It is waiting to see if we are just another flicker of noise, or if we are a species that can, against all indifferent odds, choose to be a light for itself. Build.